Before we get into everything that happened in that city, before we talk about the betrayal, the scheme, the man with silver temples and expensive suits and hands that had done things nobody asked about, I need you to understand one thing about Zara Cole. She was not naive. She was not reckless. She was not the kind of woman who missed things. She was a 27-year-old black woman from Atlanta who had spent her whole life reading rooms that were not designed for her, reading people who would rather she didn't notice them, reading situations that wore friendly faces over sharp intentions. She was sharp, she was perceptive, she was good, and she still didn't see it coming. Because some traps are not built to look like traps. Some traps are built to look like opportunities. Some traps are built to look like fellowship letters that arrive on a Tuesday morning while you're standing barefoot in your kitchen, still in your sleep shirt, reading your name on a page that says, "You've been selected. You've been chosen. Come to Milan. Your time has come." And here is the thing about being chosen. When you've spent years doing excellent work in a world that keeps looking past you, when you've submitted and been overlooked and shown up and been underestimated and kept going anyway, because what else are you going to do? When that letter finally arrives, you do not interrogate it. You read it 3 times to make sure it's real, and then you call your best friend and you scream, and then you start packing. You do not ask who opened this door. You walk through it, because finally, something is moving in your direction. That was Zara. That was the morning of the fellowship letter. She should have asked who opened the door, but she didn't know she needed to, not yet.
She landed in Milan on a rainy morning. Not the romantic, cinematic, European kind of rain that makes everything look like a painting. The real kind. Cold, sideways, relentless. The kind that says, "This city doesn't care about your arrival. Adjust yourself." She stood outside Stazione Centrale with her suitcase, her canvases wrapped in plastic, and a thermos sticking out of her tote bag like a small flag of stubbornness. And she looked up at the stone face of that city and she thought, 6 months. You have 6 months. Don't waste them being afraid. And then she went to find her best friend, who was already waiting for her under a red umbrella, grinning like someone who had been building a life in this city for 3 years and could not wait to fold Zara into it. Elena Marchetti, 28 years old, Italian-American, New York raised, Milan adopted. She had been Zara's best friend since they were 20 years old at Spelman College. This unlikely pairing that made no sense on paper and made complete sense in practice, the way real friendships often do. They had seen each other through breakups and family crises, and the particular exhaustion of being ambitious women in spaces that hadn't been designed for them. They had been each other's constants. They had been each other's truest people. Or so Zara believed. Here is what Zara did not know that first rainy morning, as Elena hugged her and said, "You look like a wet sunflower," and pulled her inside and made her real pasta. Elena had been the one to submit Zara's fellowship application in the first place. Not because Zara asked her to, not because Zara even knew. Elena had taken Zara's portfolio, written a personal statement, and submitted the application. And she had done it because a woman named Lucia Vitelli had paid her to. 40,000 euros. And a clear debt. That was the price of Zara Cole's best friendship. That was the number Elena had calculated, when she was drowning in financial ruin, was worth the cost of bringing her closest friend to a city controlled by a crime family, without telling her, without warning her, without giving her the choice to say no. But we will get to Elena's reckoning. Trust me, she gets hers. Right now, I need you to stay with Zara, because Zara was arriving in Milan with paint in her locks and hope in her chest, and 11 days later she was going to walk into a gallery on Via Solferino and meet a man who would change the shape of everything. The gallery was showing contemporary African diaspora art. Zara went alone because Elena had a work dinner. She went in that focused, consuming way she had in art spaces, moving through a room like she was having a private conversation with every painting on the wall, not performing attention but actually giving it, fully, which made the people around her slightly uncomfortable in the way people get when they realize someone near them is actually present when they themselves are only pretending to be. She was standing in front of a large canvas, a woman in blue, back to the viewer, looking out over dark water, when a voice behind her said, in English with a light Italian edge, "She's not looking at the water, she's looking at what the water is carrying away from her." Zara did not turn around. She studied the painting for another beat, let his interpretation land, measured it against her own. Then she said, still facing the canvas, "Or she's watching what the water is bringing toward her. Depends on the direction of the current," and that was it. That was the moment. Not because it was poetic, although it was, but because of what happened next. He paused. He actually considered what she said. He didn't dismiss it or redirect or try to reclaim the conversation. He stood there and thought about it, and then he moved to stand beside her, and she saw him for the first time. Tall, dark suit, no tie, silver at the temples, startling because the rest of him read younger. The jaw, the posture, the stillness of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything to a room. He looked at the painting with the expression of a man who had just been given a new way to see something, and was genuinely grateful for it. I hadn't considered that. Most people assume loss when they see water, but water is directional. It has intention. They moved through the rest of the exhibition together. They talked about the work, and then about other things, how Milan felt different from Rome, what she was building in her studio, whether grief was a color or a texture. By the end of the evening, he had asked her to dinner and she had declined. He accepted her refusal with such unhurried, undefensive grace that she found herself thinking about it on the taxi ride home in a way that surprised her. She told Elena about him that night, described him the way you describe someone when you don't want to admit you're interested. Silver temples, dark suit, bought the painting. Elena listened, and near the end of the conversation she asked, "What's his last name?" He didn't say. Something moved across Elena's face, just for a second, gone before it fully formed. She refilled her wine glass and said lightly, "Milan is full of mysterious men with money and good taste. Just be careful, be careful." That's what she said, be careful. The woman who had already delivered Zara into the hands of the Vitelli family told her to be careful, and because Zara trusted her, because Zara had no reason yet to hear the sound underneath the words, she laughed, and Elena laughed with her, and neither of them said what was actually happening in that kitchen. His full name was Marco Aldo Vitelli, and if Zara had Googled that name before she ever spoke to him, she would have found the architecture of a family empire, import-export holdings, luxury hospitality, private arts funding, presented to the world with the polish of legitimate business, the kind of polish that takes generations to apply. She would not have found in the first pages of search results anything that looked like the truth of what that family was. The Vitellis had spent 40 years making sure of that. What she would have found, what she did eventually find, later, after it all came apart, was the name on her fellowship, the Accademia Vitelli Fellowship for Contemporary Visual Arts, his family's name, on the thing that had brought her here, the answer to the question she never thought to ask, who built this door? But that was later. Right now, 11 days into her Milan life, what she knew about him was this. He showed up at her studio on a Saturday morning with coffee and a cornetto in a paper bag, uninvited, unashamed, and completely unrattled by the fact that she answered the door in paint-covered jeans and 3 pencils in her locks, and a look on her face that said she had not ordered any of this. "How do you know where I work?" The fellowship announcement included your studio address. "I looked you up." "So you looked me up." "I was curious. There is coffee in this bag, and a cornetto, which you may not like if you're used to American pastry, but I thought the gesture was worth the risk." She stared at him for a long moment, and then she stepped back from the door and said, "You have 20 minutes, I'm working." He stayed for 2 hours, and here is what he did during those 2 hours, nothing. He sat in the corner on a paint-smeared stool and watched her work in complete, comfortable silence. He did not fill the quiet with unnecessary words. He did not fidget or check his phone or clear his throat to remind her he was there. He watched her paint the way you watch something that matters, fully present, fully still, as if leaving would mean missing something irreplaceable. And when she finally stopped and turned around, he looked at the canvas and said, "The woman in the center, she's holding something behind her back. What is it?" And she said, "That's the question I'm still answering." And he nodded like that was exactly the right response. "Now, I need you to understand something about what was happening here. Because it would be easy to look at this scene and think, charming man, nice gesture, what's the problem?" And the problem, the devastating, complicated problem, is that none of this was performance. Marco Vitelli did not sit on that stool for 2 hours because his family's plan required it. He sat there because he wanted to. What he felt in that studio, and in the gallery before it, and in every conversation that followed, was real. Genuinely, messily, inconveniently real. And that is what makes this story a tragedy, rather than just a crime. A crime is clean. A crime has a villain and a victim and a line between them. What happened here was not clean. Not even close. What Marco did not tell her, here's the part they don't show you in the romantic montage. Here's the part that was happening underneath all the gallery conversations and canal walks and late-night restaurant meals where the owner brought food they hadn't ordered. 3 months before the fellowship was announced, Don Aldo Vitelli, Marco's father, the patriarch, the man who had built the family's operations over 4 decades and run them from a hospital bed after his first stroke, had called Marco into his bedroom and explained a plan, calmly, simply. The way the old man explained everything, as if describing logistics rather than human lives. There was a black American shipping magnate named James Cole. He controlled Atlantic freight routes that the Vitelli operation needed. He had refused every approach, cautious, well-insulated, unreachable through the usual channels. He also had a daughter, a young artist named Zara Cole, with a strong portfolio and no institutional support. The family's fellowship existed. It would now serve a second purpose. The girl would come to Milan. Marco would get close to her. The father, loving, protective, suddenly aware that his daughter was living in a city controlled by people who had his attention, would negotiate. That was the plan, start to finish. Marco had sat with that for a long time, and then he had said, "This is not something I will do." And the old man had said, with the patience of someone who had heard that sentence before, "Go to the gallery on Thursday, see the exhibition. That is all I am asking." And Marco had gone. Because refusing Don Aldo a first step was easier than refusing the whole architecture of what his life required, and because, this is the truth he never said aloud, he had looked at Zara's paintings online before the gallery, and something in him had moved that hadn't moved in years. He had told himself he was going to assess the situation, find a way to redirect his father's plan, be the reasonable man in an unreasonable scheme. And then she had stood in front of that painting without even looking at him, and turned his interpretation back on him with the calm precision of someone who had spent years learning to read things that other people only glanced at, and he had realized in the space of 30 seconds that he was in a great deal of trouble. The problem with men who are good at lying to themselves is that they eventually lose track of where the lie ends and the truth begins, and by the time they figure it out, someone else has already paid the price of the confusion. So for the next 6 weeks, 2 things existed simultaneously inside Marco Vitelli: his growing, genuine, completely unplanned love for Zara Cole, and the original, instrumental scheme that had set the whole thing in motion. He had not contacted her father. He had not passed information. He had told himself he was managing it. He had told himself he would find a way to dismantle the plan before it reached its next stage. He had told himself a great many things, but his sister Lucia had her own timeline. And Elena Marchetti was still on the payroll, and Don Aldo had not built a 40-year empire by waiting for his son to feel comfortable with the difficult parts. The plan was moving, with or without Marco's blessing, and the only person in that whole city who didn't know it was Zara. The weeks that followed, they fell into each other, the way people do when they are both, despite everything, ready. He took her to an unmarked restaurant so old it had no sign, where the owner greeted him by his first name, and brought food they hadn't ordered. She took him to the flea market at Viale Papiniano on a Saturday, where he bought a cracked ceramic tile with a faded blue bird on it for €3 and carried it home like it was precious. He showed her a street in the Navigli, where the light hit the canal water on autumn afternoons in a way that made the world look briefly impossible. She showed him her in-progress canvases, not the polished gallery versions, but the false starts, the scraped-down surfaces where the ghost of the earlier paintings still showed through like a confession. He was careful with her, not cautious, careful. There's a difference. Caution is about protecting yourself. Carefulness is about protecting the other person. He made space for her to exist exactly as she was. When she argued, and she argued directly without softening it, he didn't deflect or retreat. He engaged. He changed his position when her logic was stronger than his. She noticed. She kept noticing. Because that is rare, genuinely, frustratingly rare. But she noticed other things too, eventually. The way a second man was always visible at a distance when Marco walked her home. The way his face closed down when certain calls came through at dinner. The way he redirected, cleanly, skillfully, but she caught it. When she asked what exactly he did, she asked twice. Both times he gave her the prospectus version. Hospitality, arts, import. That's the answer from a brochure, not from a person. I know, one day I'm going to ask that question and need a real answer. When that day comes, I'll give you one. That day was coming, faster than either of them knew. 6 weeks in, on a cold October night, with the Naviglio Grande below them black and still, and the restaurant lights making their reflections in the water, He kissed her for the first time, and she kissed him back, fully and without games, and then she looked at him and said the thing that would echo through everything that followed. I am not built for games. I will not be managed or maneuvered. I will not be someone's project or experiment. If you want something real from me, say it plainly and mean it. If you don't, say that too, and we'll both go home. He looked at her. The city was dark and cold around them, and he said, I want something real from you. I have wanted it from the moment you told me that water has a direction. He was not lying. That is the part that I need you to hold on to. In that moment, on that bridge, he was not lying, but he was also holding a secret large enough to level everything they were building. And the ground underneath their love had been mined before they ever stood on it. That is the cruelty of this story. Not that a man lied to a woman, but that the truest thing he felt for her was growing out of the same soil as the most corrupt thing he had ever allowed, and those two things could not coexist forever. Eventually one of them would have to give. Lucia Vitelli invited Zara to lunch on a Thursday in November. She did it with warmth and smiles and the air of a woman who simply wanted to get to know the person making her brother happy. They met at a restaurant in the Quadrilatero della Moda, the kind of place where no prices appear on the menu, and the water arrives before you sit down. Lucia was beautiful in the way of very expensive, very sharp things. Close-cropped hair, clothes that had stopped trying to announce their cost, a manner so smooth that sitting across from her felt like being handled without ever being touched. She asked about Zara's work with what seemed like genuine interest. She asked about Atlanta, about Zara's parents, whether they were close to her, what her father did. And Zara, open by nature, honest by principle, with no reason yet to see the room for what it was, answered freely. She gave information the way generous people do, as a form of respect, as a signal of good faith. She did not know she was being catalogued. Near the end of the meal, Lucia leaned forward with the specific intimacy of someone about to say something just for you, just between you two, woman to woman. I want to be honest with you, Zara, because I think you're a woman who values honesty. Our family is very specific. The world Marco lives in can be difficult for someone who hasn't grown up near it. I'm not warning you away from him. I'm saying, if you choose to stay, stay with your eyes open. Now let me tell you what that was. That was not kindness. That was Lucia Vitelli, laying the groundwork for her own innocence. She was building a record. She had warned the girl. She had tried to protect her. If anything went wrong later, Lucia had done her due diligence. It was a masterwork of preemptive self-defense delivered in the register of sisterly concern. And it worked, because Zara walked home from that lunch with a feeling of having been touched by something she couldn't name, filed it in the back of her mind, and kept moving. She was sharp, but nobody is sharp enough to see every angle of a trap built by people who have been building traps their whole lives. Dante Russo had known Marco since Marco was a grieving boy who had just lost his mother and wasn't yet sure what kind of man his father's world was going to make him. Dante had watched over the years as Marco closed door after door on his own better instincts, the architecture degree, the year in Seville, the graduate acceptance in Copenhagen he had never told anyone about. He had watched Marco come home each time because that is what men from families like the Vitellis do, because the cost of leaving feels higher than the cost of staying until, of course, you realize it isn't. And Dante had watched Marco fall in love with Zara Cole, the way he watched him do a handful of things in his life that were genuinely against his own interests, with a combination of exasperation and something that was very close to love. Because Dante had no children, he had given a large portion of that instinct to Marco without noticing it happen, which was why what he was carrying was killing him. He had known about the plan from the beginning. Elena's recruitment, the fellowship as leverage, the whole architecture of it. He had known, and for 2 months he had watched Marco fall completely, watched Zara open fully, and he had told himself he was watching to see how it unfolded. He had told himself Marco was handling it. He had told himself a great many comfortable, convenient things. And then, on a Tuesday in November, Lucia authorized the next phase, a direct message to James Cole using Zara as proof of access. And Dante realized the moment for watching had expired. He knocked on Marco's office door. He closed it behind him. And he said, Lucia has moved to the next phase. She wants to use Zara directly. A message to the father, a demonstration of access. The silence in that office had weight, temperature. Marco stood up from his desk slowly. Lucia does not touch her. Your father gave the authorization directly. 3 weeks ago, he didn't consult you because he knew what you would say. 3 weeks. Don Aldo had authorized this 3 weeks ago and said nothing. Marco turned to face the window, and after a long silence, long enough for Dante to understand the full weight of what was being decided, Marco said, "How long have you known? Not about the authorization, about all of it. Elena, everything." And Dante, who was at bottom an honest man trapped in a life that didn't often permit honesty, held Marco's gaze and said, "From the beginning." The room was very quiet, and then Marco said the thing that told Dante everything about what kind of man he had become, underneath everything the family had made him. "I have to tell her. If you tell her, she will leave. I know. I need you to sit with that for a second." Marco Vitelli, head of a crime family, the man who had authorized things in his professional life that would make your stomach turn, in that moment, chose the truth. He chose to give Zara the truth knowing full well it would cost him her, not as a strategy, not as a way to manage the situation. He chose it because she had stood on a bridge and told him she was not built for games, and because the version of himself that she had seen and believed in was a man he had decided, finally, to be faithful to, even if it meant losing her. That night, he went to her studio. She was mid-canvas when the knock came. She opened the door holding a palette knife, expecting the building super, and found Marco standing in the hallway with the face of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply arriving to carry it out. She saw it immediately, that specific gravity, and she stepped back without speaking because she already knew, the way you sometimes know, that whatever was coming would require her to be still. He stood in the center of her studio, surrounded by her paintings on every wall, and he said, "I need to tell you something, all of it, and I need you to let me finish before you respond, because if you stop me in the middle, I won't have the courage to get to the end." She set down the palette knife. She sat on the paint-smeared stool. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him and said nothing, and he told her, all of it. His father's plan, the fellowship as leverage, her father's business as the real target, Elena's recruitment, Lucia's authorization, and the phase that was now in motion, the 3 weeks he had known and been trying to find a way to stop it. He told her with no softening, no defense, no explanation offered as an excuse, just the truth, placed fully in her hands, and then silence. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say, "But I love you." He told her the truth, and he stood there, and he waited. For a long time, Zara looked at the floor. The studio smelled of linseed oil and turpentine. And then she looked up, and the first word she said was not Marco's name. It was not "how could you." It was not any of the things you might expect. It was one name, spoken like a verdict. Elena. Not a question. The sound of a word that used to mean one thing and now meant another. The sound of a friendship, being understood for the first time in its actual shape. That is a specific kind of grief, y'all. That is the grief of realizing that someone you loved was a door you were never meant to walk through freely. That the openness, the laughter, the history, all of it was real, and all of it was also something else at the same time. That's the grief that doesn't make noise. That's the grief that just reorganizes you, quietly, from the inside out. Zara walked to the window. She stood with her back to Marco, looking out at the city, and after a long time she said, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Lucia is about to move, and you need to know before she does. Because you told me on that bridge you were not built for games. Because I owe you the truth. Because I am done pretending I can manage this without you knowing." She was still, and then she turned from the window with a composure that had nothing performative about it. Not cold, not angry, not theatrical. Clear, the specific clarity of a woman who has been given the full picture and is now deciding what she will do with it. "You don't get to be my protector. You don't get to ride in and fix this. You were part of building it. I know. I need you to leave. Right now. I need to think." He left. He did not linger in the doorway. He did not ask for anything. He walked out and pulled the door closed and was gone. And Zara sat back down on that stool, alone in the middle of all her paintings, and she breathed. And she picked up her palette knife. And she went back to work, because that was who she was. That was the thing none of them had fully calculated for. She didn't break. She worked. And then she picked up her phone and called Elena. Elena answered on the third ring, and Zara could hear it immediately, that compressed, braced quality in a voice that has been waiting for a call it hoped would never come. Before Elena said a single word, Zara knew. Not because she was psychic, because she knew Elena. 11 years of knowing a person means you can hear the guilt between their syllables. Zara said, "Don't do the confused voice, don't perform surprise, just tell me yes or no, and then come here." A long silence, and then, barely above a whisper, "Yes." Elena arrived 25 minutes later. She had been crying, the involuntary, uncontrolled kind, the kind that happens when a body has been holding something for too long and finally cannot sustain the compression. She stood in the doorway looking so undone that Zara, who had every right to every feeling she was carrying, felt the complicated pull of old love for someone who has just shown you their worst self. That is one of the cruelest things about loving people. It doesn't switch off just because they hurt you. It just gets complicated. Painfully, inconveniently complicated. Zara did not receive her warmly. She stepped back from the door and stood in the center of the studio and waited. Elena came in. She kept her distance. She had enough self-awareness left to know what the room required. "How long?" "8 months before you came." Lucia approached me through a contact in fashion. She said she needed an artist with your profile. She said it was legitimate. She said, "Stop." Not what she said. "What did you know?" Elena stopped. She took a breath. And she said it plainly, because at this point there was nothing left to protect. "I knew there was interest in your father's business. I told myself if nothing went further than you being here and meeting people, then you'd have the fellowship and nothing bad would happen, and it would just be a transaction. That I would never have to tell you. A transaction. Yes, you sold me. What did they give you? 40,000 euros. And they cleared a debt. I was drowning, Zara. I know that doesn't. No, it doesn't. 40,000 euros. That was the price of 11 years of friendship. That was what Elena had decided, in her most desperate moment, that Zara Cole was worth as a commodity. Not as a person, not as a sister friend. As a piece on a board. And the reason it destroyed Zara in a way that Lucia's scheming hadn't, the reason this was the wound that went deepest, was because Elena knew her. Elena had been in the room when Zara cried. Elena had known her father. Elena had eaten her mother's food and held her hand through the hard years. Elena had not handed a stranger to a crime family. She had handed someone she loved, and told herself it was fine. Zara did not scream. She did not rage. She looked at Elena with the full, clear, unmerciful truth of someone who has loved you and is now standing on the other side of what you did with that love. And she said, "I want you to leave this apartment. I want you to leave my life. Not because I don't understand what debt feels like. Not because I can't see that you were desperate. I believe you were. But you had 100 moments to warn me. 100 moments where you could have picked up a phone. And you didn't. Because you were protecting yourself. And I was the cost of that protection. I cannot carry that alongside the friendship." Elena reached for her hand. Zara stepped back. Not angrily, not dramatically, just clearly. One quiet step. And that step was more devastating than anything she could have shouted. Because it said, "I am choosing the distance. I am choosing it deliberately. This is not emotion. This is a decision." Elena said, "I'm sorry, Zara. I'm so sorry." Zara said, "I know you are." And then Elena left, and the studio was empty. And Zara stood in it and felt the full weight of the evening and did not buckle under it. She held it. And then she went back to her canvas, and she worked for 2 hours, and at the end of it, the woman in the painting was holding her own hands behind her back. Not a weapon, not a secret, her own hands. Holding herself together where no one else could reach. 3 days later, 2 in the afternoon, Zara's phone buzzed with a message forwarded through Elena's number. A photograph. Zara entering her apartment building, time-stamped from that same morning, and one line of text. "Tell your father Zara is happy in Milan. We hope she remains so." Lucia had moved. Now here is where I need you to pay close attention, because this is the moment in stories like this, where women are supposed to fall apart. This is the moment of maximum vulnerability, maximum exposure, your location documented, your safety implicitly threatened, a crime family reminding you that they can see you anytime they choose. This is where most narratives would have the woman call for help, wait to be rescued, find a man to fix it. Zara looked at that message, and she smiled, not out of bravery, not out of defiance, out of relief, because she had known this was coming. And she had not been sitting still for 3 days waiting to be scared. She had been preparing. She called Dante Russo. She said, I need a meeting. Marco and Lucia both in the same room tonight. Can you arrange that? Dante paused. She heard him exhale, slowly, like a man being given permission to set something down that he has been carrying for a very long time. And he said, "Tonight, 7 o'clock. I'll send an address." The building was in Porta Venezia, 3rd floor, private room, dark wood, low lighting, the kind of quiet that money buys. When Zara walked in, Marco was at the window and Lucia was seated at the table. Composed, still, wearing her composure like armor, one hand resting on the surface in a posture of complete control. Zara walked in. She sat directly across from Lucia. She placed her phone on the table, face up, with Lucia's message displayed. And she said, "You made a mistake. Not the plan. I can see how the plan made sense to you. The mistake was assuming that because I came here on your terms, I was on your terms. I am not." Lucia looked at the phone, then at Zara. Her expression didn't move. She was waiting for the substance. Zara gave it to her. "I have a recorded conversation with Elena in which she outlines the full arrangement, amounts paid, dates, and the specific instruction to bring me here. I have a second document, notarized, filed with a law firm in Atlanta, archived and accessible in the event anything happens to me or my family. And I have this." She placed a single page on the table, a formal statement, signed, filed that afternoon. "That is not a threat, that is not leverage, that is a record. Because I am not here to negotiate with you or find a peaceful arrangement. I am here to tell you, once, clearly, you are done using me." Lucia picked up the page. She read it. Slowly. Set it down. And then she looked at Zara with, "And this is the part I want you to remember. Genuine assessment. Not contempt, not dismissal. Assessment. The look of a skilled opponent, recognizing that she has been met. You're smarter than I expected. You shouldn't have expected anything about me. You didn't know me. You just knew what you wanted to use me for." And then she stood. She picked up her phone, and she looked at Marco for the first time since entering the room. And what she saw in his face, what he made no attempt to hide or manage, was the most exposed thing she had ever seen on a human face. Not guilt, not regret, something rawer than both. The look of a man watching something irreplaceable walk toward the door, and knowing he has no right to stop it, and would not stop it even if he could. She looked at him. She said quietly, "Just for him, what you told me the other night, I know what it cost you. I know it was real. All of what was between us, the real parts, those were real. But I am not able to love across this much deception and pretend the ground is solid. So I'm going to finish my time here, finish my work and go home. And you're going to let me." She picked up her coat. She put it on. She walked to the door, and with her hand on the doorframe, she turned one final time, not to Marco, not to Lucia, to the room itself, to everything the room represented, and she said the words that had been forming in her chest since Elena had said yes on the phone. "I will rather die than want your love, all of you. Your love comes with conditions I did not agree to, in a language I was never taught, for purposes I was never told. I will rather go home empty than stay here full of someone else's agenda." And she walked out. And nobody called after her, because some exits are so complete, so utterly without crack or wavering, that interrupting them would be its own kind of violation. Even Lucia Vitelli, who had never in her life let anything move her that she hadn't chosen to let move her, sat in that chair, and was, for one long moment, completely still. The room was quiet. The lamp in the courtyard, below, burned yellow in the cold, and Marco stood at the window and watched the street until a car appeared and disappeared around a corner. And then he stood there a little longer, even after it was gone. 2 days before Zara's flight home, Don Aldo Vitelli came to her studio. He came in a wool coat despite the heated building, moving slowly with a cane, carrying himself with the dense, heavy presence of very old and very dangerous men, who have long since stopped needing to announce themselves. Dante was behind him. Nobody had warned her they were coming. She opened the door. She looked at the man who had built the trap she had walked into, and she stepped back, because whatever he was about to say, she was going to hear it standing. The old man walked through her studio slowly. He looked at all of it, the canvases, the in-progress work, the ghost images of what she'd scraped and rebuilt. He spent the longest time in front of the woman holding her own hands behind her back. Then he looked at Zara. "My son was not supposed to become what he became with you. That was not the plan. I know, it is inconvenient. Yes, it is." The old man was quiet for a moment. Then, "Marco told me he would leave the family, leave everything. if you had asked him to stay." Zara held his gaze. She did not speak. He said, "You did not ask him to stay. May I ask why?" She looked at this old man, at the damage he had authorized, at the love for his son she could see running underneath everything like a deep, misguided current, and she said, "Because a man who leaves his whole life for a woman he has known 4 months is not leaving for love. He is leaving for relief, and I am not interested in being anyone's relief. If Marco changes his life, it needs to be because he chooses it on his own terms, not as a debt to me, not as an escape route, his own terms. And if he does that, and if enough time passes and enough truth settles, then whatever comes after is something different, but not this, not while I'm still the wound." Don Aldo Vitelli was silent for a very long time, and then he gave a single nod. One nod, from a 71-year-old patriarch who had built a crime empire and ordered men's fates and never once looked back. One nod to a 27-year-old black American woman in a paint-covered studio who had just told him the clearest truth he had heard in years. "You are an extraordinary woman, Signorina Cole. I know, I've always known. The people in this story forgot it for a while. I never did." He left. She watched the car pull away from the courtyard below. Then she went back to work. Marco came on the morning of her flight, 6:15. She had slept in the studio. She couldn't bear the apartment anymore, and she had been awake before dawn, standing at the window with her thermos, watching Milan come alive in the dark. She knew he would come. That's the thing about really knowing someone. You know their patterns, even as everything falls apart. He knocked. She opened the door. He was carrying nothing. No gesture, no offering. Just himself, in a jacket she hadn't seen before, looking like a man who had been stripped down to what was true about him, and had decided to show up in that truth even though it meant arriving with nothing to offer. "I'm not here to ask you to stay. Good. I'm here because I needed to say, without any strategy, without any design, what I felt for you was real. Every part of it that was mine was real. I know that doesn't undo the rest. I know it doesn't give you anything useful. But I needed you to have it, as a fact, not a plea." She looked at him. She held all of it. The gallery, the canal, the morning he sat silently on her paint-smeared stool for 2 hours, because he understood her work was its own language, and he was there to listen. She held all of that, and she said, "I know it was real. That part. That's the hardest part, Marco. The betrayal I can put down, but the real thing that doesn't go down easy." He nodded, and then, because even now he knew how to speak her language, he asked, "What will you paint when you get home?" She almost smiled. "I don't know yet, but I know the feeling I'm starting from. That's usually enough." He looked at her one more time, the way you look at something when you are memorizing it, and then he stepped back from the doorway. He turned. He walked down the hallway. He did not look back. She watched until he turned the corner and was gone. Then she closed the door. She stood in that empty studio. Linseed oil turpentine, the smell of her own work, and she breathed it in one final time. She picked up her coat, her bag, her thermos, and she walked out of the Brera studio building into the November morning. Milan was cold and relentless, and made no adjustments for anyone. It never had. That was fine. She had never needed it to. She got into the car. She looked out the window as the city moved past her. The canals, the stone buildings, the markets just waking up. She put in her earbuds. She thought about the painting she would make when she got back to Atlanta. Not of Milan, not of Marco, not of any of the people who had moved her around a board she didn't know she was standing on. She would paint a woman arriving somewhere, moving toward something, the direction of the current, intentional and clear, not loss, not grief. Coming toward. The plane lifted from Malpensa at 9:47. Below her the Po Valley spread out flat and gray and impossibly beautiful, and then it disappeared into cloud, and then there was nothing but blue. Zara Cole closed her eyes. She did not look back. Now, before we close this story, let me tell you what happened to each of them, because the thing about betrayal, the thing that stories like this don't always tell you, is that it doesn't just change the person who was betrayed. It moves through everyone it touched. It reorganizes lives. It forces reckonings. It collects its debts in ways and at times that the people who set it in motion didn't get to choose. 12 months after she left Milan, Zara Cole opened a solo exhibition in Atlanta called Current. 14 large-format paintings, every figure in motion, every figure moving towards something, not running from something. The centerpiece, the woman holding her own hands behind her back, sold on opening night for more than Zara had earned in the previous 3 years combined. The buyer wished to remain anonymous. The transaction was routed through a gallery in Milan. She did not inquire further. She did not need to. Elena Marchetti left Milan 8 days after Zara departed. She went back to New York. She found small, unglamorous work. She began the slow, unsexy process of becoming someone she could actually live with, which is, when you have done what Elena did, the hardest possible work, and the only work that matters. 9 months later, she wrote Zara a 12-page handwritten letter. Zara read it twice. She did not write back. Not because she couldn't forgive. She could eventually on her own terms and in her own time, but because forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things, and she had decided, with clarity and without cruelty, that she could extend the first without owing the second. Lucia Vitelli continued. That is the simple and sometimes frustrating truth of women like her, they continue. She found other plans, other pieces to move. She never mentioned Zara Cole again. She did not think about her, except once, at an art opening in Florence, where she saw a reproduction of one of Zara's paintings in a catalogue. The woman in motion, moving towards something with her whole body. Lucia looked at it longer than she intended, then she moved on. Some lessons land on people who are not equipped to receive them. That is a tragedy of a different kind. Donaldo Vitelli died in February, 7 weeks after his visit to the studio. He died in his own bed, with Marco beside him. The last thing he said, Marco told this to Dante later, quietly over grappa, was, "The girl was right about you. I should have given you Copenhagen." That sentence. 7 words of recognition from a dying old man who had spent a lifetime making choices for his children that closed their other doors. 7 words that said, "I see now what I built for you and what I cost you." 7 words that could not undo what they acknowledged, but they landed, and Marco carried them. I think he needed them. Dante Russo retired 6 months after that, moved to Lake Como, got a dog, slept through the night for the first time in 30 years. He was not entirely at peace with what he had known and not said. He didn't expect to be. He lived with the weight the way you live with weight that is yours to carry, not crushed by it, not free of it, but upright, moving, accountable to it. That is the most anyone can ask of someone who chose wrong and knows it. And Marco Vitelli began the process of stepping back from the family's operations in the spring following his father's death. It was not a dramatic break. It was not an announcement. It was methodical, quiet, and careful. The dismantling of a life he had inherited rather than built, replaced piece by piece with decisions that were actually his. He sold holdings. He transferred governance. He hired lawyers. He took his time. He did it not as a grand gesture for anyone, not as proof of anything, not as a message to Zara. He did it because the version of himself he had watched her see, the man on the paint-smeared stool, the man at the flea market with the €3 tile, the man who had chosen the truth over his own safety, that was the man he had decided to be faithful to, for himself, on his own terms, exactly as she had said it needed to be done. He never contacted her. He understood what she had meant on that bridge, and he honored it. He kept the painting from the Via Solferino gallery on his living room wall, the woman in blue, back to the viewer, facing the water. Every morning he walked past it, and by now he had his own answer to the question of her direction. She was not watching what was being carried away. She was watching what was coming toward her. She was waiting for something to arrive. She knew she was ready. And Zara was in Atlanta, building, working, living in color and intention, and the specific freedom of a woman who has been through the fire and walked out carrying only what was hers. She painted stories that felt like memories, and memories that felt like prophecy, and every canvas started from a feeling she had learned in a studio in Milan on a cold November night, the feeling of knowing exactly what you will and will not accept, the feeling of choosing yourself, fully, clearly, without apology, when the world presents you with 100 reasons to choose something less. That is not a small thing. That is not a given. A lot of women walk out of stories like this one, broken at the foundation, rebuilt smaller, careful in a way that cost them their full size. Zara did not. She walked out of Milan, and she kept her full size. She kept her openness, and her directness, and her willingness to love. She just knew now, as she hadn't quite known before, that love offered on false terms is not love at all. It is a transaction, and she had decided, once and for all, exactly what she was worth. More than 40,000 euros. More than a crime family's attention. More than a beautiful man's guilt, or a best friend's regret, or a dying patriarch's deathbed recognition. More than all of it put together. She was worth her own whole life. And she was finally, completely, living it. And that is the story. That is, I will rather die than want your love. A story about a woman who was moved like a chess piece by people who thought her openness was naivety, her warmth was softness, her trust was a door they could walk through without consequence. A story about the moment she discovered what had been done and chose to be exactly who she had always been, just with her eyes fully open this time. The water had a direction, it always did. She just had to make sure she was the one choosing which way to let it carry her. Thank you for watching. This has been Makjang Melanin TV. Like, subscribe, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their full size is worth keeping.